We are here with Patrik Os, and we are discussing a YouTube video which we will link to. It says, Pastor rebukes and warns City Council. Pastor Zack Morgan of Apologia Church spoke before the Phoenix City Council and confronted them for failing to uphold Arizona law. This is an important duty and is part of the responsibility of the local church. Good evening, Patrik. Welcome.
Good evening.
So we both watched this video. Basically, Zack Morgan. He's in front of City Council, and he's warning them about the murder of unborn babies, which we agree with. Abortion is murder, and he actually is using arguments that are very inconsistent, and he's also bearing false witness, and I would say he's also dishonoring our forefathers at the same time with the way he's trying to argue against abortion. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Excellent. Let's do it.
Okay, so the first point I want to make is that as Christians, we are to be extremely careful to not bear false witness, even if it's mistakenly. So repeating history, for example, I often warn others about, especially when everyone wants to paint Hitler as the worst monster in human history and say he killed 6 million Jews, he did this and that. And even if Hitler was a bad guy, which I don't think he was a good man, we at the same time, we can't bear false witness and lie in order to support our argument.
Right.
Secondly, I would say that what Zack does in his speech is he's dishonoring our forefathers. At the same time, he's essentially throwing our forefathers under the bus in order to try to get City Council to move on this type of issue.
Abortion is the premeditated killing of innocent preborn human beings developing in the wombs of their mothers with malice aforethought.
We agree, right?
Yes.
Here's where it gets interesting.
Abortion is murder, and if you're repelled by that statement and all that's been said already today, and you continue to support child murder, you must hear loud and clearly, you are on the wrong side of history.
Patrik, where do you usually hear this term, you're on the wrong side of history? Where do we usually hear that from?
It's a common phrase used by progressive leftist Marxists.
Yeah, that's the first thing I was thinking. Like, he's using this term "wrong side of history," and you'll see it again.
Several times.
He repeats this phrase.
Isn't it unimaginably mind-boggling that 150 years ago, African Americans were murdered, tortured, butchered, and horrifically oppressed? And I think we would all agree that what they endured was absolutely evil, abominable, and unjust. But why were they treated in such a way? It's because they were deemed less than human by the majority populace. And I think we would all agree in here that the majority populace was in serious error and wound up on the wrong side of history.
So I don't know if you have any initial thoughts about just what he said right there about
where to start.
Tortured and butchered.
Tortured, butchered, and murdered, tortured, butchered, and horrifically oppressed.
I want to know what slaves were butchered. Like,
Yeah.
Except for maybe Fried Green Tomatoes, that movie, didn't they say? I don't know. It was just nuts. Yeah.
Yeah. What cuts of meat are you butchering them for? I'm curious.
Right. Exactly.
So, I mean, we would say, yeah, in the case of abortion, they are being murdered.
They're being dismembered. Yeah, absolutely.
They are being considered less than human. You'll even hear that being said. But in the South, where slavery was primary, even in throughout the United States history, I don't recall Negroes ever being considered less than human.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think anyone considered them to be not humans. I think it's clear that they were always considered humans when you think about how much effort was spent in Christianizing them. I think it would be like you don't Christianize your dog. You don't preach the gospel to your house cat. They were humans. They were clearly treated as such. They might not have always been treated in the most ideal circumstances, but certainly as humans always.
Yeah, and I thought it was pretty ridiculous of a statement. I'm thinking it seems to me it's very counterintuitive to spend what would be equivalent to today thousands of dollars, and then you purchase them, and then now we're gonna bring them back to our property just to butcher and torture them. I mean, even when you consider, even if you're just thinking of them as property, like you would even one of your animals, even if you considered them that low, which they didn't, that would be very counterintuitive to do that. Something you spent a lot of money on to help you work, and then to turn around and just say, yeah, they're black, so we're going to torture and butcher them.
And then you have to go buy more.
And go buy more, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is just historically inaccurate. So
yeah.
I was thinking, I'm not sure if you know much about the Three-Fifths Compromise, but
well, I mean, to start with, it was a compromise, right? This was never the real opinions of anyone involved. And it wasn't about their humanity. It was about voting rights. I shouldn't say voting rights. It was about apportionment for voting, representation. Since we have a proportional electorate system, you want, if you're a state that is competing with others, then you want as large a voting population as possible in order to get as many representatives as possible. And so it was crass political maneuvering on the part of slaveholding states to get more representation, and it was a compromise on the part of those non-slaveholding states to make sure that they didn't get the full number that they'd hoped to get.
Yeah, so I could see where someone who is dishonest could use this three-fifth compromise as a way to deceitfully say, yeah, see, they weren't even treated as a full human. But that's not the case when you really look at the history, as you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Another point, I guess we would say, I'm not sure if you've read Robert Louis Dabney's book In Defense of Virginia and the South, but I haven't read the whole thing, but I have read portions of it. And I remember in the very beginning of the book, he was arguing that never in the history of the world has the Negro had it so good as he had it when he was under white rule in America, when he was brought over here. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, certainly, the places that these men and women were taken from in Africa had lower standards of living, than Americans at the time had. So, I mean, I don't know enough of Dabney's book to go too deep into that, but certainly we had advanced medicine. We had reading and writing that were offered to a fair portion of these slaves, and not to mention that my understanding is most of these slaves were slaves in Africa already. before being sold into America. You know, these weren't Europeans by and large didn't just go traipsing through the jungle looking for people to steal. These were people that were sold for other goods. You know, things like rum, some other finished goods, so that they weren't, you know, they weren't treated well in their own homelands, because oftentimes these were competing tribes, and they were, you know, they were despised for tribal enmity. So no, I don't think they were treated better at home at all.
Well, even today in a lot of these African countries, parents are selling off their children for food and for everything else. So most likely it was something very similar back then. But as far as slaves in America, you know, down my line, great grandfathers on the line had a plantation down south in Georgia, and you know, his slaves were given gardens and houses and clothing and medicine, and they were taken in the family pictures. They were obviously considered family. Other people would argue, but when it came time that he had to set his slaves free at the end of the war, almost all of them stayed, even after he died, and most of the family died off. The property that they were given, their houses and everything, were given to them, and they stayed on the property. They kept taking care of things. So if they were treated so horribly, I do not think they would be wanting to stay. and that was not an uncommon thing. Most of them, after they were set free, would have rather stayed with their masters, because they were given so much better and they were treated better than they would be out on their own. They knew it.
So I thought it was interesting that he says, because of abortion, we are under God's judgment, which I agree with. Mm-hmm. However, if he's comparing abortion to slavery in the United States and the way blacks were treated, we had slavery from the beginning. So in order to be consistent, wouldn't he also have to say that America was under God's judgment from the very beginning? If it was the same thing, if we were really murdering, torturing, and butchering Negroes?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, in a certain sense, America has always been under God's judgment, as much as all of humanity has, right? We're all fallen. We're all continuously committing sins. But I mean, is what he's trying to say is that there are you know, abnormal sins being committed, right? Egregious sins is the word I'm really looking for. Mm-hmm. And abortion certainly rises to that. I mean, abortion is something we, in effect, see throughout the Old Testament as, you know, these foreigners to the Israelites, who are often getting the Israelites to go along with them. They're continuously sacrificing their children to the idols of these gods. I mean, that's hardly different than abortion. I'm sure if they could have done it surgically, they would have.
Yeah.
But where we see that condemned throughout the Bible, we don't see the same treatment of slaves, because slavery was common. I'm not familiar offhand with any of the patriarchs who didn't have, in some form or fashion, slaves. It might have been different than the slavery that we saw in the United States, but I mean, it wouldn't have been categorically different. just a different of degree.
Well, yeah, and I guess I'm thinking like if it really was that we were just taking blacks and then just murdering, butchering, torturing them the same way that we're doing with unborn babies, I could see how we would be definitely under the judgment of God back then. But I guess I have a hard time believing that he actually believes that America was that bad, like he's trying to compare it. He's trying to compare the two as if they're the same, but I just don't see it being the same at all. And I just feel like it's very dishonest.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to get into the head of this man, but it seems like he wanted to write as shocking a speech as possible, and that's why he included all of this in. And I think he understood his audience, and they would probably be shocked by this. But otherwise, yeah, I don't see how. I've never heard of a historical record that shows this kind of activity happening.
Yeah. So I guess my question to you is, and Clement had mentioned this to me in an email, that if these people at Apologia Church are really concerned about abortion ending, shouldn't they be addressing the problem of black voters consistently voting for people that are allowing abortion to continue? So, I mean, what is it like? Blacks vote at a 90+% clip for people that support abortion, and if they didn't vote, then we wouldn't have abortion, likely.
Yeah, they certainly overwhelmingly favor the party of abortion, and so it is. I think you could say that blacks, on the whole, vote for abortion, which isn't strange if you also look at all of the. If you look at the actual abortion statistics, they overwhelmingly use it compared to other groups. So they do support it, and I mean, yeah, it certainly seems to be the case that we ought to be doing everything we can to ensure that if we want to end abortion for real, right? If we want it declared by the state as murder, which God has always said it is, then we need to prevent or change the minds of, whatever you want to say, the black population that continues to support it, disproportionate to their population.
Yeah, absolutely. I watched another video by Apologia Church, and it was actually one of the filmmakers, and I guess he had made a film, and he would record these people that were going to get abortions, basically boasting about how they're going to murder their baby, and they knew it was murder, and they were boasting about it. And this filmmaker, who is also from Apologia Church, he was pointing that out to the city council and calling for them to stop abortion. And he it was a very, very good message he gave them, and I appreciate that one. So I don't mean this as like a bash Apologia Church session or anything. Like I think they're doing a lot of good in a lot of areas, and they're setting a example for some of us of what we could actually be doing. They're being aggressive. They have a post-millennial outlook, and there's a lot of things to appreciate about them, but at the same time, I felt it was necessary to point out the blatant falsehoods and just to warn other Christians of things we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be lying and dishonoring our forefathers in order to push truth or trying to change society.
Yeah, Apologia Church does a lot of good. I mean, I think they're blessing a lot of people. I think they're blessing their city. But like I said earlier, I get the impression that he let his the importance of addressing the city council, and making an impression, get away from him. I remember hearing, I want to say it was R.C. Sproul talking about like a junior pastor who had asked him ahead of time, hey, how does this sound? This thing that he's going to preach. Does this is this okay? To which the guy again, I think it was Sproul, could have been somebody else, said, well, I mean, it certainly sounds good, it preaches well, but it's not scriptural. So you really shouldn't say it. And that's what I get the impression happened to this guy. And and I'm saying that because I don't know him personally, but I trust that he's doing the Lord's work out there. But just because we can use a certain segment of the population's distaste for one thing against them doesn't necessarily mean we should, right? So
Yeah.
we can make an equivalence between slavery and abortion and score points. We might even win some people to our side. But if we're using dishonest means, then we aren't communicating the truth. And if we're not communicating the truth, then we're not communicating God.
And I would say that's also maybe Christians use these kind of tactics because they don't trust that by telling the truth and that through the Spirit of God, people can be changed and God will work in it. They're trusting.
Well, they're using this. They're using the arm of the flesh to make their point work instead of trusting that God's going to work through truth and His power.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, very good points. Okay, folks, we'll talk to you next time, and God bless. Thank you.
Bless.